When you ask Google to search something for you, have you ever thought about how much energy that takes? It's reported that every day, ChatGPT alone processes over 1 billion messages, enough to power more than 10,000 homes across America for a year. The devices in our pockets have completely transformed our lives, but in doing so, they're transforming the world's energy demands in ways we're just beginning to understand. And so it puts us at a crucial crossroads. We need to adapt on a massive scale, or we need to risk building a future that is less sustainable and less secure than the one we inherited. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Vijay Gadepally. He's the Chief Technology Officer at Radium Cloud and a senior staff member at MIT's Lincoln Laboratory. He is at the forefront of this new energy landscape, helping shape a future where AI isn't just smarter, but more sustainable. This is On Energy. Dr. Gadepally, hello. Great to see you.
Chris, wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me today.
Thanks, Vijay. I've really been looking forward to talking to you. I wanted to start off just sort of with a reflection. I lived on the International Space Station, and while I was up there, there was a guitar, and so I recorded music. But how do you record music without a little electronic device? And I used GarageBand on an iPad to record the cover that I did of David Bowie's Space Oddity. And I wasn't too worried about it because the space station, it's 100% solar power. But even to send the recording down to Earth, is just using that solar power. But what I wasn't thinking about much was the energy cost of how people were going to find that video and how people were going to watch it. And I heard you had a eureka moment about energy consumption when you were chatting with a friend about video games. Can we open up with you telling us that story?
Sure. So first of all, wonderful to be here. So excited to have this conversation today. So my work in energy efficient computing, or just efficient computing altogether, really started in the middle of COVID. One of my colleagues and friends had just purchased a brand new gaming computer. And if you're an avid gamer, I'm not, but I know a lot of friends that are. These rigs are getting more and more complicated. And he had state-of-the-art GPUs, multiple GPUs, and needed liquid cooling or water running through that box in order to actually cool it down. And so we were just shooting the breeze, as a lot of us did during COVID. And this question came up of, geez, you really need that much power, that much computing power in order to play your game. And, like any good MIT scientist, by the next day, he had generated a plot from his own personal computer that had the frames per second on one side and the amount of power that his GPUs were drawing on the other side, right? So on the x-axis and the y-axis. And we found this really interesting relationship where as you increase the amount of power the GPUs are allowed to draw, the number of frames per second increased pretty significantly. And in fact, on the higher end, you're getting close to 120 frames per second. Now, I'm not a gamer, so obviously I had to ask the dumb question of, do you really need these frames per second in order to play your game? And it turns out that for most people, anywhere above 60 to 70 frames per second can do quite well. And you're spending a lot of power and thus energy in getting to those last high-end frames per second, which are somewhat imperceptible to most gamers. And so we realized that by just reducing the amount of power, you're still able to play the game, still able to have a very good experience, but you're able to do so in a far more energy efficient manner, which meant not just the amount of power draw that your GPUs were having, it also decreased the amount of water that was needed to cool it, or the amount of evaporative loss that went into that, as well as improving the reliability of these processors, because when they run hot, they become unreliable and tend to have failure.
So I'm just trying to picture what that was like. I mean, so keen on having high-speed gaming that had managed to go down the rabbit hole of getting water-cooled computers, water-cooled GPUs in order to pick the speed up to get well above maybe a usable threshold. That's pretty hardcore.
It is. And we realized during that conversation, we're like, well, I wonder if it's the same with AI, right? Are we using a lot of power in AI that's not giving us a great benefit. And that's really what sort of kicked off a series of research efforts around this, trying to understand how do we make things more energy efficient? And while doing so, can we also do things in a way that is more conducive to the environment or less of a threat to the environment while we're doing it without stopping or hampering the adoption or growth of these technologies?
So this was the 21st century equivalent of Newton's apple falling from a tree and him figuring out F equals ma. You're doing online gaming during COVID and realized, wait a minute, I mean, how fast is fast enough? And what is the actual impact of that? So it sounded like it triggered a new perspective on technological energy use. But what did you start choosing to do differently then? How did that change your direction?
So the first thing we realized is we need to rethink this. No one is even thinking about first of all, the environmental impact at that point was unclear. I think it's gained a lot more visibility in the past couple of years, still not as much as I think we should have. However, what we needed to do was increase the transparency in this problem, make this aware. I'm now excited when I talk to people and they tell me, oh yeah, that uses a lot of energy, doesn't it? And I'm like, I feel warm and fuzzy, not in a good way, but at least that, okay, the word is slowly getting out. This was not true 4 years ago, right? It was unclear what the environmental impact was. So the first is we have to increase awareness on this problem. The second is we need to rethink the way we're doing things. There has been this arms race to just build bigger and faster. And so can we as a research community start to really focus on some of these other critical issues that will help us improve efficiency and still allow us to make these gains, but do so in a far more friendly, both energy-wise or environmentally friendly-wise, way of still moving this agenda or this research and this technology forward.
Thanks. And let's just look a little about how we got here. You know, in the 90s, I had I had a BlackBerry, but I also had a personal organizer, and I had my paper notebook, and I had a pager, and I remember having all those and I had my laptop, of course, and I remember thinking, how come somebody can't just put all these, into one device that can combine all of these? And so I think it's sort of been a little bit like an evolutionary, quiet move, so that now we sort of take it for granted that all of things that were separate just 25 years ago, 30 years ago, are now here and so alluringly tempting. The energy that is in our pocket. So that evolution to me maybe has been part of the problem, in that it's been so subtle that people just aren't thinking about what some of the more hidden impacts might be.
Yeah, there's I like to share this story with people, although it's somewhat of a mea culpa type story.
Those are the best stories. It's all
Those
right.
are the best ones. Yeah, I have a young son. He's learning to read. And like any good techie dad, I went and wrote him an iPad app. And, we were reading the same stories over and over, and it was starting to get a little bit tiring. And I can tell you all about Thumper and his sisters and their friends and all of that at this point. But so I wrote this iPad app. It could take a voice prompt. He could talk to it. He could say, I want a story about, say, a little blue
Wait
truck.
a sec. You're an MIT professor, dad of a boy who's learning to read. So you don't go buy another book. you write an entire app for him that's going to read books to him or write books for him or what?
It would write books for him.
Wow.
It would generate new content based on whatever he wanted. So he was still not able to write. So he was able to speak about what he wanted. So he could use a microphone, say, I want a story about, say, a little blue truck in the forest, or a true story about goats eating Nutella. And so this would then go, it's on an iPad. It'll then go to the internet. It'll generate a story. It'll even generate some funny pictures in many cases and return a story back to him. We had little prompts that he could put if he wanted an action, an adventure, a science fiction, poem, small words, big words, right? So all these choices. And it would generate this neat little storybook. It wasn't of the highest literary quality, but it was something to help him get reading. And because the topics could change very quickly, he was very excited. Now, I had this realization. I'm also a researcher in the field, understanding the environmental impact of AI. And, did a quick back of the envelope calculation, and the reason you'll not find this in the App Store is every time you hit that generate story button on that iPad app, it was essentially using as much energy as the entire iPad's battery. Now you just don't see it, right? And coming back to what you're saying earlier, I think one of the biggest challenges here is a lot of the environmental impact is hidden from us. We don't see it. When you drive a car or you turn something on and you have that immediate feedback, you see exhaust or you see smoke coming out of your car, or you have to fill gas, you have to pay the electricity bill, you sort of see it in a very real way. But like this iPad app, there's just a button, and you could just generate those stories, multiple times a second. It was like he was driving, from here to the next state and back in an entire evening in terms of emissions, right? In an evening of just using this app, which was, again, a great tool. But, I think after that realized to turn off image generation by default, to make stories shorter. So it's those kind of small things that you can do that can start to have an impact over time.
Did you name this app that you created for your son?
Yes, it's called Vade's Storybook.
Vade's Storybook?
Yes.
Okay, so let's just use Vade's Storybook maybe as a way to talk about what's actually happening under the hood. So we all use this term AI, artificial intelligence, and then there's like different types of AI, and a term I've heard you use is generative AI. And you mentioned that he was generating. You got a generate button to generate a new story, which is tapping somehow into AI. For those of us who are not, working in supercomputing at MIT, can you just talk what's actually happening there when your son says, okay, blue truck in the forest, generate a story? What is the generative AI? What do those things mean, and what's actually happening?
So generative AI is a subfield of artificial intelligence that's really focused on generating new content that is very close to content that it's seen before. And so when we're generating either text or images or nowadays video, these algorithms are essentially trained on huge corpuses of real data. And when given some sort of a prompt, their job is to go and generate new content that they believe will be, that closely mimics what it's learned from. So in the case of the Storybook app, let's take the case that we want to write a story about goats eating Nutella. You can input that. That is then encapsulated into what's called a prompt or a query. That is then sent over the internet to a server somewhere. If you're using OpenAI or Anthropic, they have different servers, usually across the country. That prompt is then executed where it's fed as an input. It's broken up into smaller pieces called tokens. Those tokens are then processed by this AI model, which is just a series of weights, so series of numbers that it's then passed through these sometimes back and forth a few times, and out it starts producing what are called output tokens, or essentially text that is related in some way to the input text that you've submitted to it.
So it's not that much different than if I just said, okay, Vijay, I'm picturing a blue truck in a forest. Tell me a quick story. So I have just created a prompt that is now going to the cloud that is your brain, and you have throughout your entire life collected a certain you have your raw circuitry of the capability of your brain, but then you've got all your life experience, and you would now go through all of the machine learning that you've had during your life. You would generate all these various tokens of possible ideas, and then you would, using the circuitry of your brain, spit it back at me. It sounds like it's sort of like that same process.
Yeah, in principle, it's very similar to that. And in fact, that is exactly what they're trying to mimic with these systems, to simulate or emulate what we in our brains do. Now, they do so in a very different way. The math behind it is a lot different. There's an inspiration from the human brain, but it's certainly not the exact same thing. But yes, in principle, that's what we're attempting to do in certain areas. So generating content, I think your analysis of it is quite apt.
I mentioned at the outset what a typical sort of Google search could be. So I just want people to get an intuitive sense. Since, as you say, there's no direct feedback like throwing on a light switch and looking at your energy meter. So if you do just a straight Google search, if you generate a 2 meg image, or just so people get a feel, and collate it back to something that people have more of a sense of how much energy this is actually burning. Do you have any examples handy?
Yeah, absolutely. So many of us probably do things like text summarizations, where you submit maybe a document or maybe a paragraph, and you ask a generative AI tool, right? So that's the input prompt, and you're asking the tool to provide a summary of that document. If you did roughly 1,500 text summarizations, that's the equivalent of charging a 75 kilowatt hour battery, which, if you drive a Tesla, is like charging the entire Tesla battery in one shot. Similarly, if you're generating an image, like I was doing before I put a little toggle to turn that off in the storybook, or you're just generating the cartoon images these days, that's like driving your car 4 miles. And if you're doing that over and over, it really starts to add up. And sometimes we don't necessarily see what's happening.
But also, with Moore's law and all of the clever work going on, will this increased compute always mean increased power demand? Will it ever level off?
So that is a great question, and there is a lot of economics people that are working on that topic, and something that we're very interested in. In the immediate future, don't see a leveling off, just because we're seeing such a growth of this technology, and it's not even been applied to a lot of domains. So still, when I'm talking to a chatbot on a website, or I'm working with trying to understand more about, say, my insurance policy, I'm still using a much older technology to go through that. And so when those start getting replaced by generative AI under the hood, we're going to start to see a pretty fast growth in the adoption of this technology. And a lot of it will be hidden from us. We like to share the stat with people. A Google search today uses about 5 times more energy than a Google search just 5 years ago. So it's the same thing that we're doing. We're probably doing it the same number of times in a given day, but it's just that the impact of that, or the energy impact of that, has grown sort of behind the scenes. And so as we see this technology making its way throughout the world, as costs actually come down, we may actually see a growth in the utilization or usage of this technology.
Yeah, that's not super optimism building, but it's an important thing to know. Now, as a pilot, I've flown a lot of different airplanes in my life. I really respect clouds. I mean, I love them. They're, beautiful and white and fluffy and everything. But I also recognize that they can be hiding thunderstorms and lightning and hail. They can even be hiding, mountains. So I really respect clouds. And so when I think about the cloud for computing, I have sort of the white fluffy version of it in my head, because it's somebody else's problem, right? I just send it to the cloud. Mm-hmm. But the cloud, it's actually just somebody else's hardware and somebody else's software. And at the scale, if the problem is not going to level off, then what sort of problems are we facing? How do we get the speed high enough? How do we get the throughput quick enough? The delay, and then also, how do you power and cool it? What are we up against right now?
Yeah, so the cloud is has its advantages. We can certainly leverage economies of scale. Instead of everyone having GPUs plugged into their home, it is more efficient to have these sitting in a place where we can really start to make the overall infrastructure far more efficient. And so the cloud is not all bad. The negative is, I think, like you were saying, it does hide some of the costs, right? Because this computation is occurring somewhere else. So let's take a look at a typical data center and what it consists of. So there's obviously the IT equipment, which is your GPUs, your servers, your storage, some of the networking.
Just in case, what's GPU stand for?
Graphical processing unit.
Graphical processing unit. That's just like a card, a computer card or something.
That's exactly it. Yep. And these GPUs, which started in gaming, have turned into, because it turns out that a lot of the computation we do for training or inferring an AI model actually looks a lot like what people would do in playing video games. So things like ray tracing, which you're doing transformations of matrices or multiplications of matrices, is actually what GPUs are really good at. And probably one of the most efficient technologies for doing that at scale. And so that's why GPUs have really become the backbone of the growth of AI. But so those GPUs, though, however, are pretty power hungry. Each GPU today, some of the cutting edge ones, use somewhere between 700 watts to a kilowatt each of power, and they run, at a pretty high utilization. But coming back to the data center, right? So we have the IT equipment, which is certainly a major portion of the data center, and then you have your cooling.
So wait, sorry to keep interrupting, but a data center then is just the place where the cloud does its work.
That's right. So
Okay.
if you are driving by a really large nondescript building with big fences outside, there is a good chance that that's a data center, and they're all over the place. You're probably, if you live in a big city or even if you're a rural area, you're probably no more than 5 to 10 miles away from a data center at this point. They're all over the place. The data center, though, is just a building. It's made of steel and concrete. It has a power density that's 4 to 10 times higher than an average office building, just in terms of the amount of power that's used per square foot. But it's just a building nonetheless. Within that building, you have rows and rows of computing, and they're organized in racks, and you'll find server, server, server. So it's like taking thousands of laptops and putting them together in a single place. Each one of those have a power connection and an internet connection or a network connection to connect them to other computers or to the internet. And then on top of that, because like you've probably noticed with your laptop or desktop computer, or my friend that was building the gaming rig, you need to cool these processors because they want to stay usually 80 degrees Fahrenheit or less. And apologize for those that use the metric system. I'm not able to do the conversion in the top
It's
of my
okay.
head all that quickly, but let's call it 30 C or less.
It's just units. Fine.
Yes.
80 degrees Fahrenheit.
We'll
Like
call it 30 centigrade or less, right?
a nice summer's day where you could wear shorts.
Yes, yeah, yes, a nice warm day. They want to stay under that, so you need a lot of air conditioning in order to keep them cool. And there's different types of cooling technology that you might employ. The most obvious one is air cooled, where you basically take essentially a blower fan and put it right into the server to keep it cool. Some of the more sophisticated processors now use a water loop, so there's chilled water that's actually passed into the computer, and sometimes you might actually take the whole thing and just dunk it into some sort of a liquid, which is called immersion cooling, in which you might find a non-conductive liquid such as mineral oil and then dunk the entire computer in there, and then you cool the oil itself. So if you look at a typical data center, about 60 to 70% of the energy, power and energy, goes towards just the computing gear. About 29% of the remainder, that 90% of the remainder goes towards the cooling infrastructure. And then you have all the other stuff, such as lighting and security cameras and alarm systems, monitoring equipment, etc. And so it's all of these pieces. And so what we're trying to do really is see how can we reduce that IT gear, because that's obviously the tall pole in the tent, as well as if that can have this impact on the cooling technologies as well.
Right.
That's the struggle that a lot of people are having in terms of how do I, as much as data centers are, a technology, they're here, they are powering a lot of innovation, they're bringing a lot of talent to the places where they're being constructed. At the same time, it does have this impact on the local power grid. Mentioned water, as well as some of the water that they're using. These have to use fresh water, potable water, because you have these lines of water that are passing through and you don't want to muck them up. So this is good, high quality water that you're actually passing through this. And the impact's actually quite large. I mean, I've heard like a single ChatGPT conversation that you're having might use an entire bottle of water in terms of how much water is lost in that conversation, just on keeping those GPUs cool.
Wow. So you're driving your car a bunch of miles and you're drinking water the whole time.
And you're drinking, yes, exactly. Which is, these are all things that are hidden from us, and the transparency is certainly not where we'd like it to be.
And it brings me around to sustainability. If you look at like what are the classic sort of 4 pillars of energy, they are safety. How do we make sure we have safe energy, reliable energy? You don't want to cause harm, and also you want it to always be available. You want it to be affordable, and you want it to be sustainable. You want that energy to not just be here this week, but maybe 10 years from now. And so I think what we're talking here with energy in your pocket is a steadily increasing demand that people want for reliability. They want it to be affordable. But it's not liable to decrease soon. And when you draw me the picture of what one of those data center buildings looks like. How is it that we can make this then sustainable so we're not having a runaway problem here? How is it that because the scale's so big, can you just make little changes that have a big impact, or are we headed in sort of the wrong direction completely?
No, I think that there are changes that we can make at the small scale, repeating over and over, that can have a large one. And there are certainly people that are focusing on inherently more efficient algorithms. And I'll pick on, something that's somewhat recent in the news. Now it's been, a few months, but DeepSeek is an example of that, where there was a team that was able to essentially take an existing architecture, existing way of building these models, but do a couple of clever optimizations along the way. And in doing so, they were able to create a model that was competitive with some of the larger models at a fraction of the energy, a fraction of the cost, a fraction of the computing infrastructure needed to operate it. And so those are big ones. My team has been really
just a sec, Vijay. You mentioned a series of optimization steps. What do you mean? What sort of optimization?
Yeah, so they made a few really clever. So one of them is to make sure that only parts of the model, for example, that are relevant to a conversation are actually being utilized at any point in time. So you're not loading everything all the time, but you're maybe using a portion of the model that is being utilized at any given time for that. They are also very clever in using different types of number formats or precision in order to mix and match precisions, which takes a little bit of, calculation in order to make it all work out. But they're able to essentially leverage this mixed precision computing, or using different precisions in different layers, which also reduces the overall computational impact. If you're going with a number of friends out for dinner, you'll automatically try to figure out how you can all carpool and fit into the same car and try to make it there, rather than everyone driving their own car on the way there. So it's these type of small, you kind of pause for a second, like, oh, why don't three of you get in that car and the three of you get in that car? We're kind of headed in the same direction. It's sort of the same idea. Can we apply this to the problem of AI as well?
And I think, to further that car analogy, if you're just driving your standard car, before electric cars, down the highway, we have found a speed that the motor turns that is kind of its most efficient gas burning speed. And then we built a whole transmission so that the engine could run, like, we don't race the engine at 8,000 RPM all the time, or we don't try and run it at too low an RPM. We found a real optimum, and then we built a structure around it, and we streamlined the car. They become much more aerodynamically efficient. We have found ways. The core is you've got to provide energy for the car, and it's going to take a fixed amount, but you can do stuff around it to make yourself more fuel efficient, sort of like that, right?
100%. In fact, one of the experiments that we did, which we've deployed at MIT and is now utilized by the wider industry, was to say, for example, reduce the amount of power that's going to a GPU. We told the GPU, sorry, you cannot draw more than, let's say on a 700 watt GPU, you cannot draw more than 500 watts. And what we ended up seeing was something very similar to that analogy, where the overall energy consumption for, say, performing a task had gone down by nearly 20%, with a small 3 to 5% increase in the amount of time it took to get there. And in fact, I had a brilliant postdoctoral candidate in my group who actually came up with that exact analogy, because when we looked at the computing traces, what actually happens on a GPU is it processes a lot, it heats up, and then the GPU says, ooh, you're getting too hot, let's cool you down. So it actually slows itself down, does it again. And so the analogy we use to describe this to people is, it is like driving, if you've driven in Germany or on the Autobahn. It's very easy to drive at 150 kilometers per hour, maybe drop down to 80 because there's a car in front of you, go back up to 150. Or you could be that car that's driving at a constant 100. You might reach your destination, maybe the one who did the strategy of going fast and slow gets there a few minutes earlier, but the gas mileage on the car that was at a flat 100 is going to look a lot better than the one that went 150. And so same ideas that we're seeing, that intuition translates into the world of AI in a surprisingly straightforward way.
Yeah, makes sense. Let me ask you sort of a philosophical question here, Vijay. There's good and bad to everything, right? But in this case, it's easy to get enamored, like your gamer friend, and now suddenly you've got a water-cooled system taking up your whole living room. Um, is it inherently good or bad? Does this new technology, do the benefits outweigh the negatives? I think I know what your answer is going to be, but what do you think?
I I'm not sure I even have a position to make that judgment anymore. I like to tell people the train has left the station.
Yeah.
I do think, I certainly don't want to impede technology, and I do see a lot of value to these technologies. I've heard people using this for helping medical triage, helping patients on the ground. How could we possibly say that that's a bad idea, right? And that we wouldn't want to support that? We're finding new drugs, new materials that can help extend human life, can give us more fulfilling lives, remove mundane and rote tasks from us. And so, of course, we're big believers in this technology. I do think, though, it's not just good, right? And I think we tend to think of everything as a very black and white, and I always operate right in the middle of those. It's good, but we need to make sure that we're not misusing this technology or we're not using it incorrectly. And all we're trying to do is, hey, you need to be aware of the problem. I'm not saying stop using it. I'm suggesting that you be aware of it, because you might be more careful. Instead of generating, 10 clip art icons for the heck of it, maybe you generate 5 that are going to go into that presentation to help you win over your customer or your boss or whoever. Right? So we're not saying no, we're just saying think about it, right? Spend that second of your friends carpooling to a place. Spend that minute, 10 seconds, whatever it may be. We've done some examples or some experiments, for example, where we've been able to show there is a very common type of workload that we see people doing. It's called a Monte Carlo search.
Right.
What you do in that is you're trying to find out what is the right combination or right set of parameters to solve a particular problem. And typically what you do is you do something like a parameter sweep, where you actually have a machine where machines are really good is like repeating the same thing over and over with maybe slightly different inputs every single time. You say, look, I want you to look for all temperatures between 1 to 1,000 degrees and tell me when my material is going to fall apart. And you feed, it takes one simulation, it takes 1 degree. Another simulation where it does 2 degrees. And it does that 1,000 times. It repeats that calculation over and over with slightly different inputs each time. And this is used extensively across the world for every application, some of the most important applications on Earth. I'm sure that the folks who designed the space station and all use extensive, this technique. It's one of the most well-known supercomputers around the world have been designed almost to solve that problem. Because
interesting that it has a gaming name as well, a Monte Carlo simulation.
Yes, exactly. You're trying different configurations to see which one gets you the highest value or the highest output. So we were doing this in an experiment for material discovery. So you can think about either trying to uncover a new drug, a new material that solves a certain problem. And what we found is that in these type of experiments, nearly 80 to 90% of the compute is wasted. And what we mean by that is 80 to 90% of those input parameters are never going to yield you a good result. And so why are we computing all of this? And so we built a little tool that basically tracks how a particular input parameter is doing. And very early on, we can essentially predict that model is unlikely to yield a good result, and we can terminate the computation. Because it turns out in that type of application, you're often doing 100 experiments to really find the top 3 or 4. And so the remaining 95 experiments you basically remove or toss out.
So you can be clever enough to optimize the process so you don't waste energy heading down red herrings or rabbit holes, to mix my metaphors.
Yeah, exactly. Right. That's sort of the idea there. And so we're trying to build tools that can help people, right? Because it's very difficult. You or me may not be able to figure out a priori which set of parameters are important, but the machine can see that, these parameters are really not getting you, it's obviously going to work under 50 degrees. So you don't need to try 1, 2, 3, 4,
Right.
not getting you there. Maybe focus the computation on things between, 40 and 60 where you're unsure about what the result may be.
To do that, we've got to motivate people to think that this is worthwhile, right?
It's worthwhile. And, one of the aspects that I'm I think, most excited by, right? When we talk about environmental efficiency in general, there's usually like a big cost associated with it, right? You got to go install panels, batteries, rewire your home in some way. Heck, you have to even replace the light bulbs and things like that. This is one of the few areas where I'm starting to see that, hey, we can save energy and thus carbon emissions and actually save money at the same time. So if you're using a lot of cloud computing, you've racked up a huge bill, we might be able to shave the cost down of that. And you're able to do good on the environment and energy at the same time. And so there's a nice alignment of incentives that you often don't get in this field.
And the computing power, the extra brain power of AI might actually help us solve some of the problems on its own too.
Exactly, right? Using AI to help solve AI. I'll give you another maybe small example. We realized that a kilowatt hour of energy today has a different carbon emissions. Right, today's out here in Boston, a beautiful sunny day, and nice and cool. But in a summer day, we may not be able to get the same carbon intensity. And we did a really simple experiment where we essentially made the software environmentally aware. We fed it information about the environment and asked it to change the way it behaves based on what it was seeing coming in from the environment.
Oh,
And we
this
fed
is
it.
cool. So this isn't just building your data center next to Niagara Falls and using the hydroelectric power. This is actually using the artificial intelligence to make good energy decisions.
Exactly. And what we told the system something very simple. If it's a bad, if it's highly carbon intense outside at a given time, which means there's a lot of carbon emissions per kilowatt hour of energy that you're using, either give a shorter answer in the case of a chat type query, or maybe use a slightly smaller version of the model if you're doing something like object detection or object classification in images. And the results were staggering. We reduced carbon emissions in one case by about 80%, with a reduction of about 2% in accuracy over a 2-day period, which means that, yeah, 2 out of every 100 times it might have misclassified an object, but you saved 70% on the carbon emissions. We did the same thing for a chat. In fact, we used ChatGPT for this, where we told ChatGPT was, give me a short answer.
So your 5-year-old or whatever, however old, who has the Storybook app, let's just put it in a time scale. What AI usage transformation are you expecting to see by the time your son is 10, maybe 5 years from now, or when he's a young man out in the world at 25 years old, like by the year 2050 or so, in his late 20s, I guess by then? What transformations are you expecting to see over the next 5 years, over the next 25 years?
Yeah, so I think that things like healthcare, personalized medicine, right, being able to track every single thing that happens, providing medical people the most up to date picture of a person, more physiological measurements, for example. I doubt he's going to be getting a driver's license unless he really wants to, right? Because we're going to improve the quality of that technology, and I think we're going to see a big shift even in the workplace. And so I talk to a lot of youth today, sometimes against their wishes, but to kind of help them predict what is the future going to look like from a job perspective. And I see a a large number of jobs that people are currently being trained up for, or even my 5-year-old might be getting trained up for, that may not exist in a decade or 15 years, or maybe significantly scale down where it needed 5 people to do it. It can now be achieved by one person with an AI assistant on the side. So I don't have a specific answer. Unfortunately, I'm also curious to see where this goes. But I'm just hopeful that this is all used towards really improving the human experience, improving human life, improving longevity, or whatever we as a society decide is important at that time. That we're moving this technology to help with that. And, maybe avoiding all the poop emoji apps that come out and, that use a lot of energy but may not be providing as much value to society.
Vijay, I imagine you get invited to a lot of conferences, and you know what the structure of a conference is like. There's the speakers and the day, but afterwards, there's normally some sort of gathering, cocktail, restaurant time all together. And you might find yourself then not just with a regular user of artificial intelligence, but really someone who's at a powerful position running a big company. When they're talking to you, what do you tell them?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. We often talk a lot about the usage side of this, but we should also talk about the production side of it and what's going into it. And I do have an opportunity to talk to these people, usually off the record. And it usually goes something along the lines of this: folks, we have to do something about this. Data centers used within the US about 2% of our energy just a couple of years ago. We're now at 4.4%. And in about 3 to 4 years, we're going to be at somewhere between 10 to 14% of the US energy budget is going towards data centers. How do we stop that curve? And this is an all hands. We need the data center operators, the algorithm developers, the chip manufacturers to actually talk to each other and work together, because we are dropping some really big opportunities on the ground because everybody's just siloed working on their own individual problems. And so usually my plea or query a question to them is, can we get together and figure out how to work together on these problems? Because I think by working jointly, we can get some really quick, easy wins in moving forward.
And are they going to be motivated enough to do that by the bottom line of the dollar, or is that something that requires regulation, or what's going to help people to realize the importance of a power draw going from 2% to 4% to 14% in such short time? How do you motivate those real decision makers?
Yeah, so at the end of the day, I think companies are well intentioned, but they also have a fiduciary duty to produce value and to generate revenue and profit and all of that. And so I do try to align this with economic incentives. For example, for many companies, if they can reduce the amount of expenditure they have on this computing infrastructure or equipment, that does actually lead to a reduced capex or capital expenditure or operational expenditure. So that's sort of one way to look at this. The other way of looking at this is there are some opportunities that we're missing because we're not working together. And so you might be missing the next drug that you should be looking for because you're not using efficient technologies. It's a little bit of a tougher sell to make to some people, but one that definitely gets a lot of traction of, if you use this technology, you can actually do more, do better. And we can get sort of a double win out of this.
So, with your depth of expertise and experience, what are some of the quick, easiest wins that you see?
Yeah, so there's a lot that we can do very quickly. The first could be to have intelligence in the way we're actually deploying these systems across the world. Data centers and computers, they don't talk to each other, and they need to. The second is we can go and figure out what part of the computing do we actually need to do and what can we toss out. And so reduce the overall computing demands that we're putting into these computers themselves. The next thing would be to reduce the computing intensity itself, or the energy intensity of the compute. Can I generate more text per watt hour of energy? That's the next thing. And we can with newer hardware technologies and replacing legacy systems. And the final thing is to allow our software systems to become environmentally aware and change the way they behave based on real-time environmental, whether it's carbon, temperature, water usage, but using those parameters in a way we actually build software systems. Just putting these together, which is relatively straightforward, and we have laid out a blueprint for this, can yield some very quick, immediate results that can help bend the curve in our favor.
It's almost like a parallel to how you're raising your son with all of his raw abilities to become an efficient, thoughtful, productive adult in society. Sounds almost the same.
Exactly.
I guess I just want to leave it on one final question, and that is the amount of energy it's going to take, the trajectory we're on, the refinements that you're making there at MIT and the companies you work with. Are you optimistic?
I'm born optimist, so yes, I am. I think we'll figure it out. I hope we do so sooner rather than later, and that's what I'm pushing for on my end.
Appreciate the work you're doing. Vijay, I was very much looking forward to today's conversation, to someone as expert as you are in this area. And thank you very much for the time you've put into it, but also the work you're doing that you took time away from today to look at our energy future. You're also all those MIT students that you are working with, enabling them and inspiring them. And maybe most of all, thank you for clarifying exactly what happens when I push send. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here.
Today we talked with Dr. Gadepally about the real details of energy in our pocket, and I think the trajectory we're on is inevitable. We're working on those problems with some of the brightest people in the world. It's just one of the myriad ways that energy is completely interwoven into the future quality of human life around the planet. As a call to everybody, one of my favorite authors was Arthur C. Clarke, who wrote 2001 and a bunch of great books. But he said, the information age offers much to humanity. And I'd like to think that we will rise to the challenges that presents. But it's vital to remember that information, in the sense of raw data, is not knowledge, that knowledge is not wisdom, and wisdom is not foresight. Thanks everybody for joining in. I remind you how important it is to have your own personal dreams and to make daily decisions to change who you are and move yourself closer to those dreams. And most of all, enjoy this amazing ride. Till next time, I'm Chris Hadfield on Energy.
Chris Hadfield on Energy is brought to you in part by Enbridge. For many decades, Enbridge has safely and reliably delivered the energy that helps power homes, industries, and communities. Today, they're investing in the energy systems that fuel people's quality of life. Life takes energy. That's why Enbridge is shaping a better energy future, because tomorrow is on. Find out more at enbridge.com.